So, hello everybody. Welcome to this episode of About Time with me, Chris Nichols. It's the series in which I'm having conversations with people who've inspired, influenced, interacted with me at various points in the last 20 years. And someone who's been really central to that for a huge chunk of time is Kai Peters, who was Chief Executive of Ashridge Business School for a lot of the time I was there. And I'm delighted you're here, Kai. So really, thank you very much for doing it and welcome.
Oh, pleasure. Pleasure, Chris.
Great to see you. And I suppose what would be a terrific starting point, because I imagine some people who are watching this will come from my different worlds and may not know who you are and what you do. It'd be great if you could just say something about, well, anything you want to say to introduce yourself.
Okay, where to start? Just as an aside, one of my previous deans when I was working in the Netherlands was asked a question like that, and he didn't quieten down for about 4 hours, so I'll keep it significantly briefer than that. I'm a German immigrant kid to Canada who went to university there, was asked at some point after graduation, after I'd worked at IBM for a couple of years, whether I was willing to go back to Germany to sort out the family business, which took a couple of years to do. And then somebody said to me, go to business school. It'll be good for you. I said, I don't want to go to business school because they're going to have people I don't like at business schools, capitalists and greedy bastards and such like. But I was wrong. And off I went to business school at Erasmus University in the Netherlands. So I still often get asked whether I'm Dutch. And I said, no, actually not. I'm actually German. And at the end of the MBA, I was asked to stay at the university to do some projects for it. Within a year, I got promoted to being the associate director of the MBA. 2 years after that, director of the MBA. And 7 years after graduation, I was asked to be the temporary interim acting dean because the predecessor had been asked to leave. And I decided that there was a lot that needed to be done. And I just started doing it and was there for 3 or 4 years as dean, which I suppose is pretty unusual because I didn't go the path of becoming a faculty member, doing a doctorate, anything like that. I kind of came along on the managerial side. But I think my advantage was I had been through the program. And so had seen it both from the customer side, the student side, as it were, as well as from the managerial side, and I had a pretty good idea of what worked and what didn't work. I ended up coming to the UK because of a headhunter in central London on Hanover Square, and did some interviews on the phone. As all of us who have done things with headhunters, I figure in the worst case, you end up having a nice chat with somebody posh on the phone. Then you get invited for a nice cup of tea with somebody posh for a talk. And if it goes further than that, great. If it doesn't go further than that, you had a nice cup of tea. And I met with the headhunters as well as with the interview panel of Ashridge's board of directors. And the chair of the board was Prue Leith at the time, that people will know better than me, from the cooking school from the Great British Bake Off. And she was great. She said, I'm not even a cook or a chef, I'm actually a caterer. And I want you to do a good job, Kai. We're looking for somebody younger, with energy, good at technology, and with an international component. So there I was. What was entertaining, Chris, is I got the call to come along for the interview while I was in the woods in Ontario, camping. So I'm not even sure how they found me, but in any case, I got tracked down. So I flew on a cheapo airline from Toronto to London to Gatwick, had a shower at Gatwick Airport, and went straight into their interview, completely jet-lagged. So maybe there's something about not being too wound up for an interview, but being a bit sleepy that did me good. And then I started in September of 2003 and enjoyed it for the next 15 or 16 years.
Well, that's brilliant. And, I would like to talk also about what you've done since, because you haven't stopped. But, let's start with the enjoyed it bit. Because you were there through like some really massive changes, not least the financial crisis, where that was a tough old time and beyond. So what did you enjoy about it?
Well, first of all, I liked it because it was different than Erasmus University. Throughout my career, I haven't wanted to really repeat myself. Sure, I've been working in universities and in business schools for a long time, but they've all been different product market combinations. So at Erasmus University, we were mostly full-time and part-time MBA students, as well as part-time master's students. So those were working professionals, which kind of made sense from that angle, as well as younger ones. Ashridge was, of course, working with working professionals almost exclusively, with two main sorts of activity. One was learning and development, whether that was for individuals or for teams from the same organization. The other bit where you were focusing on was the organizational development. And I've always described those two as learning and development is kind of something that's continuous. It's a chronic symptom, as it were. You'll need to treat it for your whole career. Whereas organizational development was kind of, ooh, we better do something right now. It's really an emergency and we need to change things very rapidly. So I enjoyed it. One of my first things was that Ashridge I just thought was underknown. And my logic to the team was, if no one's ever heard of us, they'll never buy from us. So at least if they've heard from us, they might also not buy from us, but they might buy from us. So the 2003 to 2007 run was actually really good. We basically doubled in size, internationalized significantly, brought in all kinds of new products. But you are right, there were lots of bumps in the road. By late 2007, you could just see that budgets were being cut. You just opened the Financial Times and things were going downhill by 5% and 10% and 5% and 10% for days on end. And I started to wave the red flag really quite early to say we have to really pull in, tighten our belts, cut costs, make savings wherever we can. And I know I was interviewed at some point by Della Bradshaw of the Financial Times, and colleagues from other universities said, okay, you guys are doing really badly at Ashridge. We're all right. And I would simply say to them, look, if you can't read the economy, if as a leader you're not paying attention to the outside world, you're really not doing your job. Chris, at some point I went along to Parliament and was asked, what is the role of leadership? And I was there with Julian Birkinshaw, who's now the Dean in Western Ontario, as well as Linda Grattan. And the best definition we could come up with was sense-making on the one side of the environment and of the world and of your organization, and change management on the other. It's all fine and well if you realize something has to change, but you have to change it. So that was, I thought, a really very good definition. Yeah, so we really had to pull in our belts, tighten belts, batten down the hatches in a big way. I seem to recall we shrunk by about 25% year on year, and our staffing costs were probably about 70%. So it did mean some staff cutbacks and trying to reduce the number of externals that were just working as associates for us rather than as full-time staff. And people weren't happy about it.
No,
I seem to remember even you said,
Change, right? I mean, yeah, good practice for where we are now in the sector. But
yeah, I think you said, Kai, that's not my problem, that's on your plate. And I'm like, yeah, Chris, it is.
I applied to be chief executive when you got the job, and I'm delighted that you got the job. I'm utterly thrilled, because my life would have been quite different if I'd got it. So
yes, it definitely had its hellish moments. But in any case, we did okay.
Yeah.
The next big bump on the road was because of the 2008 recession, because afterwards interest rates went unnaturally low. And I started to learn more about pensions and pension deficits than any human being deserves to know.
Let me just say, that was so familiar, because I was on the management team of Ashridge when Leslie Hanna was chief executive, and Leslie, of course, was an economist. And I remember him, like years before, producing this memo that showed exactly when Ashridge pension deficit would become a serious problem. And I think he was right pretty much to the year, even given the fact that interest rates changed. So
yeah, and the interesting bit was that it had been closed during his time. So probably 6 to 9 months before I arrived. When I arrived, there was no pension deficit. It was probably a little bit in the positive even, but there was nothing. Then you start investigating how pensions are valued, and you end up talking to actuaries. And I would say, but the conditions you're valuing this at are the conditions for this minute, this day, right now. And the money out is going to be flowing over the next 40 years. So how does that lead to the assumptions that you're making? But arguing with actuaries is about the same fun as watching paint dry.
I have a feeling that we've done enough on pensions, but like it's another thing that chief executives have to pay attention to.
Yeah, pay
It
attention.
can
Well,
sometimes be the big thing. But I want to, to go back to, like what was good about Ashridge in its day. And actually you described me as working on the OD side, but before that, before you knew me, I was very much faculty and worked on programs. And actually even when I left, I was doing open programs, master's programs and consulting stuff. So, and I always saw it as this integrated offer. But I wonder if there's still a place in the world for that kind of thing. Or do you think the day of like that kind of business school organization has gone now?
I think it's largely gone. I cannot think of many other standalone practices at that scale doing organizational development and learning and development for a number of reasons. First of all, demand is very hard to predict. So you end up having an expert in marketing that is on your full-time staff, but there's no business in marketing. Everyone wants something around leadership, etc. That's difficult. The cycle is brutal. So with the pension deficit, and thus we needed more money, but there was a recession on, so people were not investing in learning and development in the same way. Since then, technology has developed such that you can use short online courses, MOOCs, whatever you can. You can watch a lot of YouTube videos. So, of course, executive education providers carry on. Short courses are still carrying on, but the business model, like Ashridge's standalone business model, is rare as hen's teeth. They've all become parts of institutions, as Ashridge did to become part of HALT, where there's also a balancing side of longer master's and undergraduate programs. I have a friend who was running Warwick for a long time in the Midlands, and he said he really didn't want executive education to be more than about 20% of turnover because it was too much of a roller coaster ride in terms of the income streams. But what I really did enjoy about it is you were talking to people in organizations with live issues. You were very close to what was going on in a variety of organizations. One day I'd be sitting next to the HR director of Heineken at lunch. The next day I'd be having a boozy dinner with a bunch of clients from an oil company in China called Sinopec. You would find out really interesting stuff. And it was a really very real environment. Plus, I learned personally a lot about interventions on facilitation, on working with companies, on how you're doing something different. You're not teaching undergraduates. You're really facilitating the conversation using strategy tools or leadership frameworks to keep the conversation going to solve real problems. So it has much more of a hands-on feel than some of education does, where it's much more distant. It was also great because people were there because they wanted to be. People were not sitting in the classroom playing with their telephones, as might be the situation in undergraduate program these days. Couldn't possibly comment. So there was something about willing participants, an interesting environment, and really good conversations. And I think that also extended beyond just being at the institution, but also for the invites one would get. One would swan around in interesting events in London, be a speaker here and there. And I always saw myself as something of the poster child for the institution to make sure, as much as possible, one could get the word out about the good work that we did. And remember, we managed to get all of our accreditations as well for the degree programs, which was very positive. So it was good. So I would say that the challenges were the recession, the net effect of the pension deficit, which grew to such an extent that it was unmanageable. The process then of merging with HALT was not the easiest I've ever seen, although I can't imagine mergers are ever very easy. But in retrospect, Chris, I asked myself, could we have managed to get through COVID in that situation, in that location, with what we had? And there's no way. And I think also as a leader or as the director of something, the responsibility is to the organization and to the greatest good for the greatest number. Look, I could tell you that as soon as we merged, I was the chief executive of the smaller of the two institutions, that was sooner or later going to be the out for me. But I thought, well, I can take care of myself. I'll find something to do. But for a lot of people, and a lot of people are still there, it provided them with continuity and injection of funds. And look, they're still going, which is great.
Yeah. Um, I think the Holt partnership, merger, takeover, whatever it was, has kept the place in business. It wouldn't be in business now if it
No, it
was a
wouldn't be.
standalone. Not a chance. Not a chance.
Yeah. And of course, if for anyone listening and doesn't know anything about Ashridge, you're kind of doing multiple things at the same time. On the one hand, you're running the educational practice, but on the other hand, it's a grade one listed building, which is constantly leaking and bits of the ceiling are falling down. It's a 200-bed hotel, and it's a big catering operation, probably serving 600, 700 meals a day. Um, and what the injection of funds from Halt also did is really invest in the built environment. The building is in the best shape it's been probably since it was built in the early 1800s, which is also great. So, yeah, hats off to them.
So I think what I'd like to do now is ask a bit about what. So what have you done since?
Oh, all kinds of things. So, after the merger, I was offered a sabbatical, basically because they were trying to get me out of action for a year. And I spent that time writing a book called The Business of Business Schools, which is still seemingly in print in hardcover and paperback. So I'm happy to see that. And it generally gets good comments. And I was really looking at something that I think is important for leaders. Again, it's the sense making thing. How many product market combinations are there in higher education? How do you reach out to undergraduate students? How are they different from postgrad students? How do short courses work? How do custom programs work? What are the drivers for online? What elements are there in that mix that you can outsource or insource? What's the income per day? I learned this at Ashridge. For a faculty member's day, how much income can they generate? And I looked at that, and at the one end, a faculty member can charge the NHS maybe £1,500, £1,800 a day for sage consulting advice. At the other extreme, if you're looking at some of the executive MBA programs in the States, where they have 90 students, each paying close to $200,000 per program each, that faculty member is generating about $250,000 US per teaching day. And so if you understand how these things work, you start to get good at the economics of higher education. Everything is a factor of the volume of participants times how much money they're paying, whether they're national or international students. So I did that. And then at some point the phone rang and I was asked whether I was willing to become Pro-Vice Chancellor at Coventry University to oversee the business school.
Kai, now for some of people listening to this won't know what a Pro-Vice Chancellor is probably. So do you want to say something about what a Pro-Vice Chancellor is and does?
Yes. Yeah. So the hierarchy at universities is everyone knows what a dean is. The dean is responsible for the subject area, dean of the business school, dean of the law school. The pro-vice chancellors, deputy vice chancellors, and vice chancellors then rise a level above that, although they're weird jobs, but they then look after activities across the whole university rather than in a particular faculty. So my role was to look at how business was being delivered in 6 or 7 locations together with law, as well as doing stuff for the university in international terms. So I did that for 7 years. That was interesting to me because I firmly believe that education is the best way that people can improve their lot in life. And of course, Coventry and all of the post-1992 universities that had previously been polytechnics tended to be teaching focused rather than research focused. And most of their students tended to be first in family at university, often from immigrant families. You can imagine the demographics in Coventry and in Birmingham. Large contingent from the West Indies, large contingent from the Indian subcontinent. And so I thought that was a good thing to do. And I did my best there until the next recession got Coventry, and we're in the middle of another worldwide, but definitely educational, super challenging time for a variety of reasons that I think are worth just mentioning briefly. First of all, it's populism that says foreigners are bad and there are too many immigrants and they're all going to become migrants and hide in the UK. So then the various visa restrictions come into effect. You're not allowed to bring partners along. You're not allowed to come from certain countries. You're not, as a foreigner, going to be interviewed at all in the United States, which is about the grimmest thing that I've heard. And of course, the own goal that was and is Brexit meant that all of the EU students disappeared. So all universities, certainly all the ones except the top dozen or so, are having really very challenging times. And at Coventry, it meant having to cut about 25% of costs, looking to save about £100 million, which is a big amount in anyone's books, in a business where 50 to 60% of costs are staff costs. Yeah. So it meant a couple of 100, 300 layoffs, 400 layoffs, something like that. So there I was laid off and finished working in about the end of August of 2024. And by Christmas, I was offered an interim position to be the external advisor / interim director at Bournemouth University, where I am thinking through the portfolio, making portfolio suggestions on new programs. And I'm also thinking about the types of formats. What I try and do, Chris, is put myself into the shoes of the student rather than into the shoes of the faculty member who says, I'm an expert on econometrics. I think we should have an econometrics course. I put myself into the shoes of the student, where many of them are having to work part-time. Many are still living at home. Many are looking at the fees that are being charged and saying, I don't want to be 40, 50,000 pounds in debt at the end of my undergrad. So I'm making suggestions on how to deliver in the evening or in a compressed Monday, Tuesday schedule, or offering master's degrees that are delivered 4 or 5 days every 6 weeks. So it's not changing the subjects. Everyone's looking for the holy grail of new subjects, but there aren't really holy grails of new subjects. But there's a lot that can be done with making education studyable in the right format for students.
No, I think there's something very important about looking at it from that angle. And I think there's also looking at it from the angle of what is a university for now? Bringing these two together.
Clear. I know that's a difficult one. I have philosophical difficulty with that because I studied history as my first degree. I never wanted to be a teacher in that sense, although weirdly I've ended up not far from that. But it taught me a lot of discipline. It taught me to write. It taught me to synthesize information. But it wasn't something labeled, I am studying accounting because I want to become an accountant. Clearly the humanities are having a terrible time because the fees are significant and everyone is looking for the job from university. Government rhetoric says you must get a job from university, while at the same time they're promoting the creative arts and the creativity of the United Kingdom, where I don't think they studied accounting to become actors or painters. It just seems highly unlikely to me. So I still think undergrad should be just for maturing, for looking to see what you might want to be when you grow up. And I've personally always thought that a master's degree is more of an indication of what you'd like to do if you don't know when you're 17. Look, some people know they want to be accountants. Power to them. I didn't know what I wanted to do. So I thought if I did history and political science, that would make me think about the world in a profound way. And then 6, 7 years later, I decided to go to business school, and I thought that was a nice combination.
Do you know, I didn't realise we had that in common. My first degree was history and politics, and my second was business. So I didn't know that at all. Yeah.
I focused mostly on post-French Revolution because that made the most sense to me for the environment that we're in. I thought medieval and ancient was interesting, but I didn't know what Greek and Roman battles would do for me. But I certainly thought that the foundation of the nation states and then the development since the French Revolution was pretty spot on
so
leading us to
that
where
was one of mine, and the other was modern urban history under Derek Fraser at Bradford. So very interested in social, industrial, urban history.
Yeah, Bradford in the day. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, if you say it quickly, but people think you went to Oxford, so it's fine.
If you went to Brooks and you said you went to Oxford.
So I mean, these days, a lot of my work is with universities, and I teach on something called the TMP, which you've probably heard of, which is a top management program, which lots of PVCs and the professional service equivalent goes on. So I'm always interested in what do you think that people aspiring to be vice-chancellors should be thinking about now? Like, what are the skills to be a vice-chancellor?
The skills to be the vice-chancellor are, first of all, this is an interesting question because the universities have largely been taken over by the professional services at the expense of the faculties in many, many institutions. Nearly all the post-92s, many of the international ones. The Russell Group is probably a little bit of an exception. The Vice-Chancellor's office is also pretty far removed from the faculties because they're overseeing the whole university rather than knowing what's going on. But I think what the universities really need to think about is from a strategy framework that kind of, what assets do we have? It's a kind of resource-based view of the firm. Where are we? What are we good at? What subjects are we good at? What's our local community? What alumni group do we have? And that will steer them into making sensible financial decisions. Now, if you're at a super posh university with an endless endowment and endless money, this is not so relevant. But if you're in 99% of the worldwide universities, if you don't understand where the money is coming from and being spent, this is really very grim. And the only way to make it work is by working together between professional services and the faculties. And they have sadly become disjointed. I've written a couple of articles, one's coming out I think this month, on the external factors making it difficult for business schools, populism, visas, etc. But the second one is that we're also guilty of making a mess for ourselves sometimes by not really understanding how to do centralization of services well, not understanding where the money is coming from and going to, not cooperating very well, having too many orphan programs with 12 students on them, having electives where nothing is happening on them. So there's something about running more of a tight ship. And that's really difficult because a lot of people work in universities because A, they're slightly anarchic and like to be left alone. B, for their own careers, while teaching and income generation is important, research and research income is much more important for their own careers. So to be, senior management at a university, you need empathy for the drivers of student success, but also empathy for the drivers of faculty member success. You need a long breath because everyone can think of 7 reasons why something else ought to be done, and no one can agree on what is going to be done. So you need to convince people and repeat things. And increasingly, you need to deal with all the external factors that were never such an issue in the past, Chris. The Office for Students, the government, the UK visa regulation, international visa regulation, all of these things just mean so much scrutiny and so much, in many cases, very bureaucratic and often pointless bureaucracy, so that things just take a long time. And I also found I've been the rule maker for a few things, for accreditations of business schools. What should we be looking for? The problem isn't really with the rule makers. The problem is with the rule enforcers, which are often the people in those institutions. So some of the professional service colleagues become holier than the Pope. And I said to someone at Ashridge, are you, somebody in the legal department, are you reporting to Ashridge and to me, or are you reporting to the God of law? Because it certainly feels like you're only thinking of things that are impossible. I remember one situation where we were trying to sell a contract into Saudi Arabia. And the contract comes through, and it's, of course, it says the official version is the one in Arabic. And in case of disputes, the location for the dispute will be Riyadh. And the legal department says, I want you to say that, tell them to write it so that the place of dispute will be London and the official contract will be the English one. Now, at some point you go, I hear you, it's not going to happen, is it now? Either we're going to do that business and live with the uncertainty, or we're not going to do the business. And the risk factor there, and I say this all the time, the risk is that we go broke. The risk isn't that we have some risk. The risk is that we go broke.
Before I joined Ashridge, I was business development director for probably best unnamed US energy market software company that wanted to expand into Europe it was big in the UK, but they wouldn't translate any of the literature or the software to German or French because they said, oh, everybody just needs to do it in English. So that didn't go well. It was the same sort of thing.
So careful. So what you really learn also in the senior management post is you need the right risk management and risk mitigation for the size and scale of the risk. You know, if you go, this is highly unlikely ever to cause any sort of hiccup, and we're not breaking the law, don't worry about it. Do we need to talk about it? No. Does it need to go to the board? No. We'll just carry right on through to something else, which is, you know, this is worth multiple millions. The potential fine is ginormous. If it goes wrong, we endanger the business. Well, that's a different kettle of fish then, isn't it? But everyone's always using the same risk management across the board. I don't understand why.
Yeah. So that's all good advice for folks who are moving into senior positions in universities. Something you just said to me interested me, and I just want to come back to for a moment, was around, you said the internal professional services and that kind of thing sounded to me more important than the external governance structure. Because one of the things I was going to say is, well, what as a university leader, what do you need from the external governance? Like the Office for Students is just about to get a new head. You know, Edward Peck's about to step in. I mean, does that need to be more of the same? Does it need to be radically different?
I think they're asking for more and more from UKVI as well as from the Office for Students. And one asks oneself sometimes, why? But we've seen this over the years, Chris. You know, I remember doing stuff for the NHS, and they had like 97 KPIs that they had to report to the government. There's no way you can have 97 KPIs. So I remember asking someone senior, I go, well, in higher education, if someone asks me a question, a concrete question was, what percentage of international female participants end up getting a job in the Netherlands when I was in the Netherlands? So I said 7%. And I didn't count it. I couldn't be bothered. No one wanted to know what the answer to the question was because it was not a question. It was pointless. So the NHS came back and said, oh yeah, we make them up too sometimes. The problem is sometimes policy is made on the back of stats that we've invented. So there's a bit of a danger to it, but it amused me to no end. So I do think some of the requests from the Office for Students are hardcore, but I think the way they're interpreted by the kind of risk and compliance people in universities are even more hardcore. They're very, very afraid of regulatory insight. GDPR, yeah? I remember when I started at Coventry, I was sent to a talk to say that if I left your phone number and somebody else's phone number that I worked with at the counter checking in at BA, we could be liable for a fine of 1% of turnover up to £4 million. And I'm like, oh, stop it. You know, that's not going to happen. And then 5 or 10 years later, you start to see that, whoops, the government lost the private details of 3 million people. Is there a fine? No. Facebook exposes everyone's data. Is there a fine? Yeah, £100,000. But the hullabaloo, we ended up like 20 people in the GDPR department. What did they all do all day? Make rules, right? So, yeah. I have been accused of being a bit of a cowboy on these things. But I have found it, if you don't, and you're in senior management, and you try and be super careful and risk avoidant about everything, nothing's going to happen.
Now, I'm really conscious that we're in the last 5 or 6 minutes, and you get your choice here of which question to answer. Because
one?
Well, you might get two. You might get two, yeah. So I've got one question is, so what are you doing with AI? How is that playing into your view of leadership and higher education? Maybe I'll come to the second one because it's a more personal one. But what are you doing with AI right now?
Yeah. I find AI fascinating. So there are the uses for AI rather than AI as a generic thing. You can do really good grading and feedback of essays on the back of a plan on what you're looking for. With AI, we're doing some kind of early projects in that space. I found it awfully useful for doing market research. What is the market for part-time postgraduate programs in supply chain, and who is offering that around the UK? And what numbers are on it? So kind of the research, very good for lit searches. So all of those areas are great. I chair a company in Germany that's experimenting with artificial intelligence for mental health and well-being coaching. That I think is great. But I had a hilarious example the other day. I'd been reading that a UK university was in trouble for doing a deal with a Chinese university that was close to the military. So I looked up another university in China that we're having a discussion with, and I put it into DeepSeek, which was the Chinese AI app, and I said, does such and such a university have links to the Chinese military? And the answer in DeepSeek was, this is a A1 top ranking, best in the world Chinese university who does everything right. Then I put the same, yes. Then I put the same question into ChatGPT. ChatGPT tells me this particular institution is brilliant at rocket propulsion fuel systems, that a few of the faculty members have been nicked in the US for trade secrets, and that they're in the doghouse for a couple of other things. So there you go. AI, two different applications, two very different answers. So.
Yeah. But no way to avoid thinking about it as a leader
in
anything. Yeah.
It's good. Yeah, everything has its bad side. Somebody said to me years ago, anything invented before you're born is normal. Anything invented until pick an age, 30 or 40, is progress. And anything invented after that is the work of the devil. And the work of the devil is the internet or scooters or vaping or artificial intelligence. And it's not true.
Yeah. Well, I have to say, I couldn't survive without my personal assistant, Claude, but I'm not keen on vaping or scooters. And I have no idea at all where I should go for what is the new edge in music? I don't know. But, so, final question, because I think part of this series about understanding what shapes people. And, you've told a lovely story, and I've enjoyed talking to you about it. But what really went into shaping you? What made you the leader that you are? And maybe it's what's making you the leader you are now.
I don't know. I think there's something also about birth order. So I'm the oldest of three, and also being an immigrant. So from an early age, my parents spoke English with German accents. But, if you arrive in Canada when you're 4, by the time you're 7, your English is better than your parents' English. So I would be translating things and explaining things and helping out in the family business. So it's always been kind of responsibility thrust upon one from an early age, together with having a risk willingness. If someone says, Kai, can you do a talk for 1,000 people? I'm like, okay, yeah. And I don't get super nervous about it. I'm organized around it. It's fine. So there is also something about thinking through what's required in that particular role. I'm not a reluctant manager. I didn't get thrust into it going, oh, I don't know what I'm doing. It's always been kind of with eyes open. And then you got to learn very quickly. It took a while. I remember walking into the cafeteria at Ashridge in the first day or two, and I felt like those two English guys in An American Werewolf in London, where the conversation stops, and everyone looks around and go, who's that then? And he's a Yank, even worse. And I'm like, I'm German, that's probably even worse. But anyway, and then you just have to kind of go, okay, well, I better keep chin up, shoulders back, and start shaking hands like I own the place, because otherwise I'm not going to get anything at all done. So there's the confidence that you also need.
And how do you keep yourself redeveloping or keep yourself fresh?
Well, part of it has simply been to try and keep doing different things within the higher education world. But I also never have my eggs in one basket. I still was, until last week, I sold my family business, running a family business in Germany. I'm chair of a number of things in just the housing block, but also a digital therapeutics business in Germany that I've been doing for a long time. So I do lots of other things. And I think the nice thing about Ashridge is you started also to learn about how different industries function, and you become not necessarily master of everything, but you get pretty good at figuring out how things work. And that I can then bring insights from some other field into higher education, or something that I've learned in higher education, into, learned something I learned about change management that I can explain to people. You can't just change the discussion. You also need to change the rules. Otherwise, it's not going to make a difference. All of these kind of things that are really very applicable. So I think all around, I've been very happy with all the interesting things I've had a chance to do, all the travel, all the nice people I've met, including you. So thank you.
Well, I'm delighted that you've come along today and we've had this talk. It's been fun, and we could have gone on. There's plenty more we could talk about, but I suspect that 40 minutes of the two of us is probably enough for anybody for now.
It's really, for us, it's fine. For the audience, they're like, oh my God.
Really good to see you, Kai. So I'll be back to say proper thank you in just a moment, but I just want to say thank you to anybody who's been listening to this edition. This is part of our series 1 of About Time. It's part of a series of 12 episodes, and it goes live in this first week of June, which is great news. So Kai, once again, thank you so much for being part of it. It's good to see you again, and all the best to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.